The wind howled along the jagged cliffs, whipping Seraphina Caldwell's hair as she sat motionless in her wheelchair. Below her, the ocean raged, crashing violently against the rocks as if hungry for its next victim. The sky burned with the fading light of dusk, casting an eerie glow over the scene. She could barely breathe. This couldn't be happening. Behind her stood Reginald Whitmore, a billionaire whose name carried both prestige and corruption. His perfectly tailored suit barely moved in the wind, but his piercing gaze was fixed on the edge of the cliff. He exhaled slowly, a cruel smirk forming on his lips. "You should have stayed out of this, Seraphina," he murmured. "But now it's too late." Her hands clenched the armrests of her chair. She had uncovered something dangerous, and now he was making sure she never spoke of it again. She opened her mouth to plead, but before she could say a word, Reginald grabbed the wheelchair's handles and shoved it forward. The world tilted. The rocky edge rushed toward her. Just as she felt herself tipping over into the abyss, a thunderous sound erupted behind her, the pounding hooves of Eclipse Storm. The massive thoroughbred, his dark coat glistening under the fading sun, let out a piercing cry. His instincts screamed that something was terribly wrong. In a split second, Eclipse Storm launched into action. His powerful muscles tensed as he surged forward, hooves digging into the earth. His eyes locked onto Seraphina, his rider, his responsibility. With an impossible burst of speed, he leapt toward the edge, toward her. And then, the unthinkable happened. Seraphina's scream was swallowed by the roaring wind as her body hurtled toward the jagged rocks below. The icy ocean churned beneath her, waves crashing against the cliffside like a relentless beast waiting to consume her whole. The salty spray stung her face, and for a split second she felt weightless, completely at the mercy of fate. This was how it was going to end. Then everything changed. A deafening sound, thunderous hooves pounding against stone. A massive shadow lunged over the cliff's edge, moving faster than thought. Eclipse Storm. The mighty thoroughbred had reacted on instinct, his powerful muscles propelling him forward just as Seraphina was pushed over. His massive form soared through the air, his dark coat gleaming in the fading sunlight. His eyes, sharp and wild with determination, locked onto her. The impact was brutal. Eclipse Storm's teeth clamped onto the fabric of her jacket, jerking her body sideways mid-fall. The force nearly ripped her free, but he refused to let go. As gravity threatened to drag them both into the abyss, the stallion twisted his body midair, stretching desperately toward the rocky cliffside. His powerful hooves scraped against a narrow ledge of stone, a single sliver of salvation. The impact was bone-rattling. Seraphina's jacket tore. For a terrifying second, she thought she would slip from his grasp, plummeting into the sea below. But in a final desperate motion, Eclipse Storm flung his head, sending her tumbling onto the ledge. She crashed hard against the uneven rock, pain exploding through her limbs. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she lay there, heart hammering against her ribs. Her wheelchair was gone. She barely had time to process that fact before she heard the distant splash, the unmistakable sound of metal sinking beneath the waves. If she had still been in that chair, she would be dead. Her hands trembled as she tried to push herself up, but her body was weak, stunned by the impossible sequence of events. Above her, Eclipse Storm remained perched on the ledge, his chest heaving, his nostrils flaring as he let out a powerful, defiant snort. And then, from the cliff's edge above, Reginald Whitmore let out a sharp breath. Seraphina forced herself to look up, her body aching, her pulse still erratic. He was staring down at her, eyes wide, his expression frozen between disbelief and something dangerously close to fear. He had calculated everything. He had ensured there were no loose ends. But he had never accounted for Eclipse Storm. Reginald Whitmore's fingers curled into fists as he stared down at the ledge below. She was still alive. That damn horse had done the impossible, snatching Seraphina from the jaws of death. His mind raced, his carefully crafted plan unraveling before his eyes. This was supposed to be over. Seraphina lay sprawled against the rough stone, her breathing uneven, her body still in shock. Every muscle ached from the impact, but her mind remained sharp. She forced herself to lift her head, blinking away the dizziness. Eclipse Storm stood protectively beside her, his large frame shielding her from the deadly drop below. His nostrils flared, and his ears pinned back, his body still tense from the leap that had saved her life. Above them, the wind howled, carrying the distant echo of crashing waves. Reginald took a slow step closer to the edge, his jaw clenched. This wasn't over. If she managed to climb back up, if she told someone what had happened, everything would be ruined. His reputation, his empire, his carefully constructed world would crumble in an instant. He couldn't allow that. Seraphina met his gaze, her blue eyes filled with something he hadn't expected. Not just fear, but defiance. She knew exactly what he was thinking. Even now, with her body battered and her escape seemingly impossible, she refused to cower. She had survived him once. She would survive again. Reginald's lips pressed into a thin line. Fine. If the fall hadn't finished the job, he would do it himself. He turned on his heel and disappeared from view, leaving her stranded on the ledge. But Seraphina knew better than to believe he was walking away for good. He was coming back. And when he did, he wouldn't make the same mistake twice. Eclipse Storm pawed at the ground, restless. He could sense the danger, the lingering threat. Seraphina reached for him, her fingers brushing against his dark coat. "We have to move," she whispered, her voice hoarse. There had to be a way out. She wouldn't just sit here and wait for Reginald to return. If she was going to survive this night, she had to act now. Seraphina's fingers trembled as they pressed against the jagged rock beneath her. The adrenaline that had surged through her veins moments ago was wearing off, replaced by a deep, aching pain that spread through her body. Her lungs burned from the sharp intake of breath, her heartbeat an erratic drum against her ribs. The weight of what had just happened crashed down on her all at once. Reginald had tried to kill her. The man she once trusted, a man her father had called a friend, had pushed her off that cliff without hesitation. If it weren't for Eclipse Storm, she would be nothing more than a lifeless body swallowed by the raging sea below. The thoroughbred stood beside her, his chest still heaving, nostrils flaring as he adjusted to the narrow ledge they had landed on. His coat glistened with sweat, the muscles beneath his dark hide twitching from exertion. He had done the impossible, reacting in an instant to save her. She reached out, her fingers brushing against his powerful neck, feeling the heat radiating from him. He had risked everything for her. She knew horses were intelligent, loyal. But this was something beyond instinct. It was a choice. She swallowed hard and forced herself to look around. The ledge was barely 5 feet wide, a cruel illusion of safety carved into the cliffside. To her left, the rock wall stretched upward in an unforgiving incline, jagged and impossible to scale. To her right, the abyss yawned open, the ocean waiting hungrily below. The realization settled deep in her gut. She was trapped. Even if her legs worked, she doubted she could have climbed back up. But now, she had no way out. A gust of wind howled past them, kicking up loose dirt and stinging her cheeks. She turned her gaze upward, toward the cliff's edge. Reginald was gone. For a fleeting second, she allowed herself to hope. Had he left? Had he panicked and run? But she crushed that thought as quickly as it came. Men like Reginald Whitmore didn't walk away from unfinished business. If anything, this setback would only make him more dangerous. Eclipse Storm let out a deep warning snort, his ears flicking forward in alarm. Seraphina stiffened. He had sensed something. She held her breath, straining to listen beyond the roar of the waves below. For a few agonizing seconds, all she could hear was the pounding of her own heart. But then there it was. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, measured, purposeful. A shadow shifted above them. Reginald was coming back. And this time, he wouldn't rely on gravity to do his dirty work. Seraphina's stomach lurched. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't wait for him to find a way down and finish what he started. Her fingers dug into Eclipse Storm's mane as panic threatened to overtake her. She needed a plan. No. But there was only one way off this ledge. And it was straight down. Seraphina's breath came in short, uneven gasps as she pressed her palm against the cold, jagged rock beside her. She was out of time. Above, the slow, deliberate footsteps of Reginald Whitmore echoed against the cliffside, a haunting reminder that he was closing in. He wasn't rushing. He didn't need to. She had nowhere to go. And he knew it. Eclipse Storm stood beside her, his muscles still tense, his powerful body radiating heat. His dark eyes darted toward the top of the cliff, ears pinned back in warning. He knew danger was near. He could feel it the same way she could. But he wasn't afraid. He was waiting. Waiting for her to decide what to do next. Her mind raced, scanning every possibility, every escape route. There was none. She couldn't climb. She couldn't run. And if she stayed, Reginald would find a way to reach her. He would push her again, and this time there would be no miraculous save. Her gaze flickered downward. The waves crashed against the rocks below, white foam swirling like hungry jaws waiting for her. It was a straight drop, too high, too dangerous. If she hit the water wrong, she'd be knocked unconscious instantly. If the current pulled her under, she wouldn't have the strength to fight it. If there were rocks hidden beneath the surface, she didn't even want to think about that. But what other choice did she have? A sudden voice broke through the wind. His voice. "I have to admit, Seraphina, you're tougher than I expected." Reginald's words dripped with amusement, but there was an edge to them. Annoyance, frustration. "That horse of yours, impressive. But this ends now." Her blood turned to ice. He was close. Eclipse Storm let out a deep, rumbling snort, shifting his weight as if preparing for something. Seraphina looked at him. He wasn't just waiting. He was ready. A crazy, reckless thought formed in her mind. No, it was impossible. She couldn't, could she? Her fingers tightened in his mane. Her heart pounded. She thought of every time she had ridden Eclipse Storm, every moment they had moved as one, every impossible jump they had taken together in the past. Did she trust him? The answer came before she could even finish the question. Yes. Without another second of hesitation, Seraphina pulled herself closer to the stallion's side. She could hear Reginald's footsteps growing louder, pebbles tumbling down the cliffside as he moved. There was no more time to think. No time for fear. Only action. She turned her face toward Eclipse Storm's ear and whispered, "Jump!" The moment the word left her lips, the stallion leapt from the cliff. For a split second, the world stood still. And then, they plunged into the abyss. The world dissolved into chaos as Seraphina and Eclipse Storm plunged into the abyss. The wind howled past her ears, tearing at her clothes, her stomach twisting with the sheer terror of freefall. The ocean below rushed toward them, a dark, merciless force waiting to consume them whole. She clung to the stallion's mane with everything she had, her fingers locked in a desperate grip. Time slowed, stretching each second into eternity. The impact was coming. There was no stopping it. Eclipse Storm, driven by sheer instinct, twisted his body midair, adjusting to the descent. His powerful legs kicked against nothing but empty space, his muscles straining as he fought for control where there was none. Seraphina knew he had never made a leap like this before. No horse had. It was suicide. But it was also their only chance. Either they survived together, or they didn't survive at all. Then, impact. They slammed into the ocean like a falling meteor. The force of it was catastrophic. Seraphina was ripped from Eclipse Storm's back, swallowed instantly by the freezing water. It was like being punched on every inch of her body at once. The breath knocked from her lungs before she could even gasp. The world flipped upside down, waves crashing over her in a merciless grip. She was sinking. The cold burned like fire, wrapping around her limbs, pulling her downward into the dark, endless depths. She fought. Her arms flailed against the weight of the ocean, but her muscles felt sluggish, her movements weak. The current twisted her body, spinning her in circles, making it impossible to tell which way was up. Her lungs screamed for air. Dots of white light burst in her vision. The salty water filled her mouth, her nose, her ears. This was worse than the fall. This was drowning. Then a shadow. A presence. Movement cutting through the water. Through the blur of panic, Seraphina saw him. Eclipse Storm. His massive body moved with purpose, his hooves slicing through the current as he searched for her. His dark eyes flickered in the fading light, locking onto her sinking form. He had found her. She reached out, her fingers barely stretching toward him, but she was too weak, too deep. She was slipping away. Then, teeth. A sudden, sharp pull at her jacket. A force dragging her upward. He had her. With a powerful surge, Eclipse Storm kicked against the water, propelling them both toward the shimmering light above. Seraphina clung to consciousness, fighting against the darkness creeping at the edges of her vision. The surface was close, so close. Her lungs felt like they would explode. One last pull, one last kick, and then air. She gasped violently as they broke through the surface, coughing and choking as oxygen flooded her burning lungs. The salty air stung her throat, but she didn't care. She was alive. Eclipse Storm paddled beside her, his breath labored, his body shivering from exertion, but he kept them afloat. He had saved her. Again. Then, a sound. A presence. She turned her head toward the cliffs above and felt ice settle in her veins. Reginald Whitmore was still there. He stood at the edge, staring down, his face eerily still. For the first time, the man who had tried to kill her looked afraid. Reginald Whitmore stood at the edge of the cliff, staring down at the ocean below as if his mind refused to accept what his eyes were seeing. Seraphina Caldwell was still alive. He had watched her fall, had seen her wheelchair vanish into the abyss, swallowed by the merciless waves. By all logic, she should have been gone, erased from existence. But there she was, gasping for air, clinging to that damn horse like some impossible miracle. The wind howled against his back, rattling the loose stones beneath his feet, but he didn't move. He was frozen in place, his hands clenched at his sides, his pulse hammering in his ears. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. He had calculated everything, every angle, every outcome, except this. He hadn't accounted for the horse. He hadn't imagined that Eclipse Storm, with some unnatural, almost human level of intelligence, would do what no other creature could. Seraphina tilted her head back, her drenched hair sticking to her face, salt water burning in her lungs as she struggled to stay afloat. Every muscle in her body ached, her limbs felt like lead, but when her gaze locked onto Reginald's, she didn't look away. She saw everything in his expression. First, disbelief. Then, something much darker, fear. Not fear of what she might do, but fear of what she represented. His failure. And yet, the fear didn't last long. It never did with men like him. Within seconds, it had hardened into something far worse, determination. Reginald took a slow, deliberate step back from the cliff's edge. He wasn't leaving. He was regrouping. The realization sent a sharp wave of dread through Seraphina's exhausted body. He was already planning his next move. The icy water sloshed against her chin as another wave rolled in. Her fingers dug into Eclipse Storm's soaked mane, her breath hitching in her throat. She wasn't safe yet. Reginald had tried to kill her once, and now that she had survived, he had only one option left, to finish what he started. He wasn't going to wait for the ocean to do his work for him. He would come down to the shoreline, where she would be weak, exhausted, unable to fight back. And this time, he wouldn't leave room for error. But what he didn't know, what he had never understood, was that Seraphina wasn't that same girl anymore. She wasn't the fragile, helpless thing he had once dismissed. She had fallen, she had nearly drowned, but she had survived. And she wasn't going to let him take that away from her. Her fingers tightened in Eclipse Storm's mane. If Reginald was coming for her, then she would be ready. The freezing water clung to Seraphina like iron chains, dragging at her limbs, numbing her fingers, sapping what little strength she had left. She couldn't stop. She couldn't rest. Every breath burned in her chest, her body trembling violently from exhaustion, but none of that mattered. Reginald was coming. She didn't know how long it would take him to find a way down to the shoreline, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. He wouldn't leave without finishing what he started. Eclipse Storm bobbed beside her, his massive frame rising and falling with the waves. His dark coat was slick with seawater, his nostrils flaring, his ears pricked forward. He was listening. Even in the chaos, in the cold, in the impossible circumstances they had found themselves in, the stallion was still aware, calculating, waiting. His instincts told him what Seraphina already knew. They were still in danger. Her fingers trembled as she reached for his mane, her arms screaming in protest. "Storm, we have to go," she whispered, her voice hoarse, barely carrying over the sound of the crashing waves. She had no strength left. But she had him, and that had to be enough. She pulled herself toward him, her soaked body pressing against his flank. The effort sent pain splintering through her muscles, her limbs nearly giving out beneath her. Her body wanted to quit, but she refused. She dug deep, using the last reserves of her will to drag herself onto his back. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't smooth. But she made it. She slumped forward, her arms wrapping around his thick, powerful neck, feeling his heat against her frozen skin. The stallion didn't hesitate. He knew what she needed. Without a single command, he pushed forward, his muscles coiling as he cut through the waves with steady, determined strokes. The shore wasn't far, but in the open water, they were vulnerable. If Reginald had found a way down, if he was already waiting for her on land, she would have nowhere to run. Her heart pounded as she lifted her head, scanning the distant shoreline. Almost there. The jagged cliffs loomed behind them, stretching high into the darkening sky, their edges sharpened by the last hints of fading daylight. The wind howled, carrying the scent of salt and damp earth. They just had to make it a little farther. Then, a sound. Low at first, barely audible over the crashing waves. But as the seconds passed, it grew louder. The unmistakable growl of an approaching vehicle. Seraphina's breath hitched. Reginald wasn't alone. He was bringing reinforcements. The low, guttural growl of an engine cut through the roaring waves, sending a jolt of panic through Seraphina's exhausted body. Reginald wasn't coming alone. The shoreline was still at least 50 yards away, but now, every inch of water between them and land felt like an impossible distance. She had fought too hard to stop now. Gritting her teeth, she tightened her grip around Eclipse Storm's neck, pressing her forehead against his slick coat. "Faster, boy. We have to get to shore before they do." The stallion didn't need to be told twice. His massive body surged forward with renewed force, cutting through the waves, his powerful strokes pushing them closer to land. Seraphina felt the shift. He wasn't just swimming, he was charging. He sensed the danger, just as she did, and he was ready to fight for survival. As they neared the shallows, her mind raced through the possibilities. Who was with Reginald? He was rich, powerful. Buying silence and obedience was second nature to men like him. He could have brought hired men, people paid to make sure she never made it off this beach alive. Would they have weapons? Were they already waiting? Her chest tightened at the thought, but she forced herself to focus. Survival first. Fear later. The headlights of a black SUV flickered through the thickening mist as the vehicle skidded to a stop near the shoreline. The doors slammed open. Seraphina's heart pounded in her chest, a sharp spike of adrenaline cutting through her exhaustion. Two men stepped out, both tall, both built like they had been handpicked for intimidation. One of them carried something in his hand, and even through the dim light, she could see the unmistakable shape of a firearm. Her stomach clenched. She had no time. Eclipse Storm's hooves hit the shallows, his body rising out of the water as he stormed forward. The sudden shift nearly sent Seraphina tumbling off his back, but she gripped harder, pulling herself upright. She had to think fast. Reginald emerged from the passenger side of the SUV, his suit no longer pristine, his usual calm mask replaced by something colder, more desperate. This wasn't just about silencing her anymore. This was personal. "Seraphina, be smart about this," he called out, his voice carrying over the waves. "You're exhausted. You're injured. You don't have anywhere to go." She felt Eclipse Storm's body tense beneath her. The stallion knew a predator when he saw one. Reginald took a slow step forward, his polished shoes sinking slightly into the damp sand. "This is your last chance to make this easy," he continued, his voice smooth, rehearsed, the voice of a man used to getting what he wanted. "Come with me. Let's talk. I'll take care of everything. But if you try to run—" his head tilted slightly, a ghost of a smile playing at his lips, "you won't make it far." Seraphina's pulse pounded in her ears. There was no way he was letting her leave alive. Her eyes flicked to the two men standing by the SUV. They were watching her closely, waiting for a signal. The one with the gun shifted slightly, angling himself in a way that made her blood run cold. They weren't here to capture her. They were here to eliminate her. Her grip on Eclipse Storm's mane tightened. She wasn't going to let that happen. "Storm, we run." The stallion launched forward. The gun fired, and all hell broke loose. The gunshot shattered the night. The sharp crack echoed across the beach, drowning out the roar of the waves. Seraphina felt the bullet before she heard it, a sharp, whistling blur slicing through the air, so close it burned past her cheek. Too close. Eclipse Storm didn't hesitate. He exploded forward. The wet sand gave way beneath his hooves as he surged ahead, faster than any of them could have predicted. 1 second, Seraphina was staring down the barrel of a gun. The next, she was a blur of motion, racing toward survival. "Shoot her!" Reginald's voice cut through the chaos, but the hired men weren't prepared for the raw, untamed force of a 1,200-pound thoroughbred charging at full speed. The man with the gun stumbled, raising his weapon again, but he was too slow. Eclipse Storm was a force of nature. His massive hooves slammed into the sand, kicking up debris as he barreled straight toward the man with the gun. The last thing the thug saw was the dark fury of a warhorse bred for speed and power, before Eclipse Storm crashed into him. The impact was brutal. The man let out a strangled yell as he was thrown backward, his body hitting the ground with a sickening thud. The gun went flying. It landed several feet away, buried halfway in the sand. Seraphina barely had time to register it before Eclipse Storm veered left, dodging the second man who tried to grab at his reins. But no one could stop them now. Reginald took a staggering step backward, his face contorted in rage and disbelief. His plan had unraveled in front of him. The girl he had tried to kill, twice, was still here. Still fighting. Still winning. Seraphina's breath was ragged, her fingers locked in Eclipse Storm's mane. Her body ached, exhaustion clawed at her, but she forced herself to stay focused. They needed to end this. No. Eclipse Storm skidded to a halt near the fallen gun. This was her chance. With shaking hands, Seraphina slid off his back, her legs useless beneath her as she tumbled onto the sand. The impact sent a sharp jolt through her spine, But she didn't stop moving. She crawled, dug her fingers into the sand, reached. Her hand closed around the cold metal of the gun. Reginald's expression changed instantly. His smug arrogance disappeared, replaced by something new, fear. "Seraphina," his voice was suddenly softer, calculated, trying to regain control. "You don't want to do this." She gritted her teeth, her fingers tightening around the weapon. He had wanted her dead. He had thrown her off a cliff, watched her drown, hunted her down like an animal. And now he was afraid. "Neither did I, Reginald." She raised the gun. Reginald froze. For the first time, he was powerless. The second thug scrambled to his feet, but it was already over. Headlights flooded the beach. Sirens cut through the night. In the distance, red and blue lights flashed, growing brighter with every passing second. The police had arrived. Reginald whipped around, eyes wide, panic settling in. He had no more options, no more power. His perfectly controlled world had crumbled. Eclipse Storm snorted, stamping his hooves beside Seraphina, a silent guardian standing between her and the man who had tried to destroy her. Reginald turned to run, but it was too late. Within seconds, he was surrounded. The officers rushed in, weapons drawn. Reginald Whitmore, billionaire, kingmaker, untouchable businessman, was finally caught. Seraphina let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. It was over. Eclipse Storm nudged her gently, his soft breath warm against her cheek. She turned, running a shaky hand down his soaked mane, her throat tightening. He had saved her life, again and again. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against him. "We did it, Storm," she whispered, tears burning her eyes. "We survived. And this time, no one would take that away from her."